This is the first of two lessons where we're going to look at how the problems of the industrial era were solved. In this lesson, we're going to take a look at federal, state, and local solutions to problems that occurred under the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. The Progressive Era spans the period roughly from between 1900 and 1917. It includes people that ran for public office, both Republicans and Democrats, that promised to fix the problems of the industrial era, using what you see on the screen here, the idea that what was good for the people should guide government actions. The Progressives were not a unified group of people, but in general believed in the four principles that you see here. They were moralists. They felt that government needed to act once it was purified of the corruption in government, that the weakest element of society must be protected, and there was a paternalistic, I know best attitude of what should be done. Theodore Roosevelt was our first progressive president. He was President William McKinley's vice president, but when McKinley was assassinated in 1901, he stepped in as president. In running for election himself in 1904, he ran under a square deal platform where he promised equal opportunity for all Americans. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. Let's take a look at some of the major legislation that occurred under his presidency. We can see here that the railroads are going to come under additional scrutiny with the Elkins Act of 1903 and the Hepburn Act of 1906. Rebates used by railroads, which gave big discounts to their largest customers, are going to be outlawed. This is because this was very anti-competitive on the part of the railroads. It prevented small businesses from competing with the big guys because the big guys were getting discounted shipping rates. Additionally, the Hepburn Act is going to strengthen the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was already regulating the railroads, by allowing it to set maximum railroad rates. We can see here also that the food and medicine industries are going to come under additional scrutiny, and both industries are going to literally get cleaned up. The Pure Food and Drug Act required that food labels and medicine labels include the ingredients on the outside so that people could see what was contained. This had the effect of cleaning up the canned food industry and the medicine industry. Companies even used in their advertising the fact that they were extremely clean and had gotten approval of that cleanliness. So companies began using the fact that they were extremely clean in their factories and plants as a selling point for their products. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 was passed as a direct result of the public outrage after they read Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, which outlined the filthy, dirty conditions of the meatpacking plants. These inspectors had the authority to go in, certify the cleanliness of the plants, and shut them down if they weren't. Taken together, these two pieces of legislation were meant to ensure a clean food supply for the public, a safe food supply for the public. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed back in 1890 prior to Roosevelt's administration. However, President Roosevelt would use the Sherman Act the way it was meant to be used, in that he was going after the trusts in court, and federal judges were ordering these trusts to be broken up into smaller competing companies. As a result of this, President Roosevelt earned the nickname the Trust Buster, but I do want to point out Roosevelt was not against all trusts. He identified good trusts and bad trusts, and the criteria he used for this was whether or not these trusts were acting in an anti-competitive manner. And he went after the companies that were acting anti-competitively in court to get them to be broken up into smaller competing companies. Teddy Roosevelt was an active outdoorsman and hunter. We can credit him with saving many parcels of land here in the United States for future generations to enjoy. He started and created our national park system. This means that the protected areas under national park control will remain in their natural state for people to enjoy forever. The federal government was not the only level of government that was busy passing reforms. Several states were busy making some changes as well. Three states stand out in particular. Wisconsin, with Governor Bob La Follette, was instrumental with a number of the reforms you see in this chart. Theodore Roosevelt as governor of New York and Woodrow Wilson as governor of New Jersey were also busy making changes to curb the abuses from the industrial era. Let's take a look at a couple of these reforms here. Keep in mind, state-level governments were very corrupt, so many of these changes were meant to either do an end run around branches of state government or to take power away from political bosses. The referendum, here in the middle of the chart, is meant to bypass the state legislature. Although I do want to point out that even though it was a state-level change, lower levels of government, county, town, village, even school districts, use referendums as well as a way to bypass the legislative body of those levels of government, because a bill is put directly to the people. On election day, individuals go in to vote, and if there's a referendum on the ballot, it's framed in a yes or no way so that upon reading the question, voters vote either yes or no, and if there are more yeses than nos, that bill automatically becomes law. Examples at the state level lately include whether or not citizens of a particular state would like to allow gay marriage. Even more recently, several states have had referendums as to whether or not the citizens of those states would like to allow for the recreational use of marijuana. Moving to the next one, a recall vote allows voters to decide or to petition to hold an election to determine if they want to remove someone from office prior to their term being up. The recall provision exists mostly in the younger states in the Midwest and Far West. Many of the eastern states do not have recall provisions in their constitutions because those constitutions were written prior to this invention, if you will. Two famous examples that made nationwide news at the time in terms of recall votes. On the left, we have the California vote, where Governor Gray Davis was actually recalled, and that was when Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor. More recently, in 2012, Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin survived a recall vote in his state. The issue that brought the recall vote was his modifying the teacher tenure provisions of that state, which led to a petition for the vote. And finally, let's take a look at the direct primary, which is extremely important today in all states, and not just at the state level. Prior to the invention of the direct primary, party bosses would decide whose turn it was to run, either as a Republican candidate or on the Democratic side as a Democratic candidate. All right, the public had no choice in terms of who would run, only at the end of the process who to vote for to hold that particular level of office. And it didn't matter whether it was federal, state, or local offices. The direct primary was meant to take that power out of the party boss's hands. The intent of the primary election was to allow voters of a particular political party, either Republican or Democrat, go in a springtime election and make the decision as to who they want to run as the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate for a particular office. Some states today have closed primaries where Republicans can only vote among the list of Republican candidates and Democrats only vote among the list of Democrat candidates. Other states have open primaries where you do not need to register as a Republican or Democrat in order to vote in a primary election. It's a little bit confusing, I know. In every case, though, it has taken the decision of who is going to run out of the hands of the party bosses. Cities enacted reforms as well, although do keep in mind that the state reforms, the primary election and referendum, were going to have an impact in where the political machines were going to lose a bit of power at the city level as well. However, restructuring city government, as you can see by these two different examples on the list, was also going to have the advantage of diminishing the power of these political machines at the cities levels. Because in the city commissioner plan, you're going to have experts in charge of their field, whether it was police, fire, sanitation, all right, in charge of their areas of expertise, so that those things in the city, particularly sanitation, would run better. A city manager plan actually restructures city government where there is no mayor, and the city council hires a manager to run the different departments of the city. So there would be commissioners, but the commissioners report to the manager, or I should say the heads of each department, may not necessarily have the title of commissioner, reports to the manager, and the city manager is hired or fired at will by the city council. Lastly, cities also passed changes to their building codes. In many instances, they first began to require building codes. These are rules that construction companies must follow in putting up buildings, either residential homes or commercial buildings. All right, they're technical, involved in the construction of the building to make the buildings safer. And what happens is you have a building inspector come and certify that these buildings were put up following these codes. And you see at the bottom of here the certificate of occupancy, which is what is needed for buildings to allow people to come in and occupy them, whether they are homes or businesses. And again, this was really in response to the tenement apartments that the urban poor lived in the late 1800s, turn of the century. So to sum up, the federal government under Teddy Roosevelt focused on business reforms, the Meat Inspection Act, Pure Food and Drug Act, additional scrutiny of the railroads, and of course conservation, the creation of our national park system. States tended to focus more on political reforms, the primary election, the referendum, to deal with corruption at the state level. Cities focused on city problems, including corrupt city government and other problems like sanitation and housing. In the next lesson, we're going to take a look at the reforms that were done under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson.